You are not on the list, sir." Before the night was over, every person inside that ballroom would wish they had known his name. Caleb Foster stopped walking and looked at the young security guard standing between him and the entrance. The guard was polite enough, but firm. Behind him, golden lights spilled through the massive glass doors of the Grand Lexington Hotel, where one of the most exclusive charity galas in Chicago was already underway. Luxury cars lined the curb. Valets hurried from vehicle to vehicle. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant evening gowns drifted toward the entrance beneath crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white roses. Caleb looked completely out of place. His navy suit had been purchased years earlier and altered twice since then. The cuffs were slightly worn. His shoes were polished but old. The gray at his temples seemed more noticeable beneath the bright hotel lights. In one hand, he carried a folded invitation. In the other, he held the quiet dignity that had carried him through far worse days than this one. "There must be a mistake," Caleb said gently. "I received an invitation." The guard examined the paper again. "I understand, sir. But your name is not appearing in our system." Caleb nodded slowly. He did not argue. Years in the army had taught him that raising your voice rarely solved anything. "Could you check one more time?" The guard entered the information again. Several seconds passed. "I am sorry." Caleb thanked him anyway. Nearby guests glanced in his direction before quickly looking away. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others did not bother hiding their assumptions. Caleb recognized those looks. He had seen them before. People often mistook simplicity for insignificance. The wind swept between the skyscrapers, carrying the cool scent of the Chicago River. Caleb adjusted his jacket and stepped aside so others could enter. A silver limousine pulled up. A famous athlete emerged. Cameras flashed. Applause followed. The doors opened immediately. Caleb remained outside. He checked his phone. One unread message waited for him. It was from Emma. His 11-year-old daughter had sent it 20 minutes earlier. "Good luck tonight, Dad. Do not forget to smile." Caleb felt himself smiling despite everything. Emma had been more excited about the gala than he was. In truth, he had almost refused the invitation. Fancy events were not his world. School maintenance schedules, parent-teacher meetings, grocery budgets, and helping with math homework felt much more familiar. But Emma had insisted. "Maybe something good is finally happening to you," she had told him. The words stayed with him now. Inside the ballroom, music drifted faintly through the glass. Hundreds of guests gathered beneath sparkling lights. Somewhere beyond those walls, the billionaire philanthropist Victoria Hale was preparing to address the crowd. News outlets called her one of the most influential women in America. Her foundation had raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Politicians attended her events. Celebrities competed for invitations. Caleb had never expected to meet her. He had planned to quietly attend the fundraiser, support the cause, and return home before Emma's bedtime. Instead, he found himself standing outside. "Sir," another voice said. Caleb turned. A second security employee approached. "We are going to ask you to remain clear of the entrance." The words were professional. The meaning was unmistakable. Caleb nodded. Of course. He stepped farther away without complaint. Across the street, reflections from the city lights shimmered on wet pavement left behind by an earlier rain. Traffic moved steadily through downtown Chicago. Life continued. Yet something felt strangely unfinished. Inside the ballroom, Victoria Hale stood behind a stage curtain reviewing the speech she had rewritten 3 times that afternoon. Tonight's event was supposed to celebrate generosity, gratitude, and the people who quietly changed lives without seeking recognition. She glanced toward the audience waiting beyond the curtain and took a slow breath. Then one of her assistants hurried toward her. The expression on the woman's face immediately caught Victoria's attention. "What is it?" Victoria asked. "There is a situation at the entrance." Victoria frowned slightly. "What kind of situation?" The assistant hesitated. "A guest is being denied entry." Victoria looked back toward the ballroom. The orchestra was beginning its introduction. Hundreds of people waited for her appearance. Yet something about the assistant's tone felt unusual. "Who is the guest?" she asked. The assistant glanced down at her tablet. Then she quietly spoke a name. And for the first time that evening, Victoria Hale forgot entirely about her speech. 3 hours before he stood outside the Grand Lexington Hotel, Caleb Foster had been balancing on a ladder inside Jefferson Elementary School, replacing a flickering light fixture above a 4th-grade classroom. The building was quiet. Most students had already gone home. Afternoon sunlight stretched across empty hallways decorated with construction paper projects and colorful drawings taped carefully to the walls. It was not glamorous work. Nobody handed out awards for changing light bulbs or repairing leaking pipes. Yet Caleb approached every task the same way he approached everything else in life. Carefully, completely, with pride. He tightened the final screw and stepped down from the ladder. "Looks good as new," he said to himself. "Dad talks to light fixtures now." Caleb turned and found Emma standing in the doorway holding her backpack. Her blonde ponytail bounced as she walked into the room. "Only the stubborn ones," Caleb replied. Emma laughed. "Mrs. Reynolds said you fixed the heater in the library. That was yesterday. And the cafeteria sink. Last week." Emma folded her arms dramatically. "You are basically the superhero of school maintenance." Caleb shook his head. "Do not tell anybody that. I have a reputation to protect." Emma grinned. Moments like these made the difficult years worth it. Caleb had learned long ago that happiness rarely arrived through grand achievements. More often, it appeared in ordinary moments. A laugh after school, a quiet dinner, a daughter who still wanted to tell him about her day. They walked together through the hallway toward the parking lot. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the pavement in the afternoon breeze. Caleb's aging pickup truck waited near the far corner of the lot. The paint had faded years ago, and the driver's side door made a strange sound every time it opened, but it was reliable. So was Caleb. "Did you remember?" Emma asked as they approached the truck. Caleb immediately knew what she meant. The Gala. "The Gala," she repeated. "I remembered." Emma narrowed her eyes suspiciously. "Did you really?" Caleb smiled. "I really did." The truth was he had spent most of the day hoping to forget about it. A black envelope had arrived in the mail nearly 2 weeks earlier. The invitation looked expensive enough to belong to another world entirely. Gold lettering, formal dress code, names of influential sponsors he had only seen on television. None of it felt like something intended for a man who spent his afternoons repairing classroom furniture. "You are still going, right?" Emma asked. Caleb unlocked the truck and opened her door. "I have not decided." "Dad." "What?" "You promised." Caleb sighed dramatically. "I made the mistake of promising before I understood what a gala actually was." Emma laughed. "It is just a fancy party." "Exactly. What is wrong with that?" Caleb looked out across the school parking lot. "Nothing." But that was not entirely true. Fancy events made him uncomfortable. Ever since leaving the army, he had built a simple life. Predictable, honest, quiet. Places filled with celebrities, executives, and cameras felt very far away from who he had become. Emma climbed into the truck and buckled her seatbelt. "You always tell me not to be afraid of new things." Caleb pointed at her. "Using my own advice against me is unfair. I learned from the best." As they drove home through tree-lined streets, Emma talked about a science project, a spelling test, and an upcoming field trip. Caleb listened carefully. He always listened. After losing his wife 8 years earlier, he had promised himself something. No matter how tired he felt, no matter how difficult life became, Emma would always know she mattered. The promise guided everything. By the time they reached their small house on the edge of town, the sun had begun to sink lower in the sky. The evening ahead seemed perfectly ordinary. Yet sitting on the passenger seat beside Caleb was the black invitation that would soon place him outside one of the most exclusive events in Chicago. He glanced at it briefly before carrying groceries into the house. To him, it was only a piece of paper. He had no way of knowing that before the night ended, that invitation would reopen a chapter of his life he thought had been closed forever. The house smelled like tomato soup and freshly baked bread by the time evening settled over the neighborhood. Caleb stood at the kitchen counter stirring a pot, while Emma sat nearby, finishing homework. Soft music played from an old radio above the refrigerator. Outside, porch lights flickered on one by one across the quiet street. It was the kind of ordinary evening Caleb valued more than most people could understand. Ordinary had become precious after years of uncertainty. "You are thinking again," Emma said without looking up from her notebook. Caleb smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "Very." She circled an answer on her worksheet. "You get that look whenever something is bothering you." Caleb carried 2 bowls to the table and sat down across from her. "Nothing is bothering me." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Dad, okay, maybe one thing. The Gala." Caleb pointed his spoon toward her. "You are getting entirely too good at this." Emma grinned proudly. I know. For a few moments they ate quietly. The comfortable kind of silence that existed between people who did not need constant conversation to feel connected. Caleb watched his daughter carefully. At 11 years old, she was beginning to resemble her mother more every year. The same bright eyes, the same stubborn determination, the same ability to see straight through him. Some days the resemblance hurt. Most days it felt like a gift. Emma set down her spoon. You miss Mom tonight. Caleb looked at her, surprised. Why would you say that? Because whenever something important happens, you always think about her. The observation landed gently, like most truths spoken by children. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly. A framed photograph sat on the nearby bookshelf. His wife smiling at a summer picnic years ago. Before hospital visits. Before loss. Before the world changed. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I do. Emma nodded as if she already knew the answer. She would tell you to go. Caleb laughed softly. To the gala? Yes. Why? Emma shrugged. Because she always made you do things you did not want to do. Caleb laughed harder at that. That is actually true. The memory warmed him. His wife had possessed a remarkable talent for pushing him beyond his comfort zone. She believed people spent too much time talking themselves out of opportunities. Caleb had always been more cautious, more reserved. Together they balanced each other. After dinner, Emma disappeared upstairs and returned carrying the black invitation. She placed it directly in front of him. There. Caleb stared at it. What am I supposed to do with that? Open it. I already opened it. Open it again. Caleb shook his head but obeyed. The heavy cardstock unfolded neatly. Gold lettering gleamed beneath the kitchen light. He read the details once more. Formal charity gala. Hosted by Victoria Hale. Grand Lexington Hotel. Chicago. Friday evening. Everything about it still felt unreal. I do not belong at places like this, he said. Emma immediately frowned. Who decides that? What? Who decides where people belong? Caleb considered the question. I guess nobody. Exactly. She pointed toward the invitation. Somebody invited you. Caleb could not argue with that logic. The truth was he did not even know why the invitation had arrived. There had been no explanation attached. No personal note. Just his name printed clearly on the envelope. Several times he had considered calling the hotel to explain there must have been a mistake. Yet somehow he never did. Later that evening, after homework was finished and dishes were washed, Caleb stood alone in the garage. A single overhead light illuminated shelves filled with tools, storage boxes, and old memories. Near the back wall sat a wooden chest he had not opened in years. Slowly he lifted the lid. Inside rested photographs, military commendations, and carefully folded documents from another chapter of his life. The army felt very far away now, almost like someone else's story. Caleb picked up an old photograph showing a younger version of himself standing beside fellow soldiers. They were smiling despite exhaustion. Time had scattered them across the country. Some he still spoke to occasionally. Others had disappeared into the natural currents of life. He returned the photograph and closed the chest. Those years had shaped him, but they did not define him anymore. Fatherhood did. Responsibility did. Service took different forms. The next morning would arrive early as always. There would be leaking faucets, broken lockers, and students needing encouragement. Yet somewhere beyond the routine waited an invitation carrying questions he could not answer. As Caleb turned off the garage light and headed back inside, he finally made a decision. He would attend the gala. Not because he expected anything special, not because he wanted attention, but because Emma believed he should. And throughout his life, the people who loved him most had usually been right. Friday arrived with the kind of gray Chicago sky that threatened rain without ever fully committing to it. Caleb spent the morning repairing a damaged classroom door, replacing 2 ceiling tiles, and helping a nervous third grader retrieve a science project from the top shelf of a storage closet. It was an ordinary day, and he was grateful for that. Ordinary days asked very little from a person beyond showing up and doing what needed to be done. By 4 o'clock, he was driving home through steady traffic, the black invitation resting once again on the passenger seat. Every time he glanced at it, he felt the same uncertainty. Emma, on the other hand, had absolutely none. The moment he walked through the front door, she appeared at the end of the hallway like someone preparing for a major mission. You are going. Caleb laughed. Hello to you too. You are going, she repeated. I have not changed my mind. Emma smiled triumphantly. Good. The next hour passed in a blur of preparation. Caleb rarely wore a suit anymore. The navy jacket had spent years protected inside a garment bag at the back of his closet. He brushed away a bit of dust and carefully adjusted the tie. Standing in front of the bedroom mirror, he barely recognized himself. The reflection looked like a man from another life. A life before school maintenance schedules and grocery store coupons. A life before grief taught him what truly mattered. Emma appeared beside him holding a small lint roller. "Hold still." Caleb obeyed. "You sound exactly like your mother." Emma grinned. "That is what everybody says." For a moment, both of them smiled at the memory. Then Emma stepped back and admired her work. "There. What? You look important." Caleb shook his head. "I look uncomfortable. Same thing at fancy events." That earned a genuine laugh. By 6 o'clock, he was driving toward downtown Chicago. The city skyline rose ahead of him like a wall of glass and light. Buildings reflected the fading evening sun. Traffic thickened. Luxury vehicles became more common with every mile. Caleb's aging pickup truck suddenly felt older than ever. Yet he continued driving. For Emma, the Grand Lexington Hotel appeared several blocks away, towering above the street with elegant stone architecture and enormous windows glowing gold against the darkening sky. Valets moved efficiently beneath a covered entrance. Photographers gathered near a red carpet. Guests emerged from sleek black sedans wearing clothing that probably cost more than Caleb's monthly mortgage payment. He parked several blocks away where public parking was available and began the short walk toward the hotel. The air carried the scent of rain and expensive perfume. As he approached, he noticed conversations slowing around him. Not because anyone recognized him. Quite the opposite. He simply did not resemble the typical guest. Most attendees moved with practiced confidence. Caleb carried himself differently. Quieter. Simpler. Yet there was something about him that years of service had left behind. A calm steadiness. The kind that could not be purchased. He reached the entrance and joined the flow of arriving guests. Crystal chandeliers sparkled through the glass doors. Music drifted from somewhere deep inside the ballroom. Laughter echoed across polished marble floors. For a brief moment, Caleb wondered if he should turn around. Nobody would know. He could drive home, help Emma finish her latest school project, and spend the evening exactly where he felt comfortable. Then his phone vibrated. One new message. "Emma, you better not leave." Caleb smiled immediately. Sometimes children possessed an almost supernatural ability to know what their parents were thinking. He typed a quick reply. "Not leaving. Promise." Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued forward. Nearby, a pair of executives discussed investment opportunities. A television personality posed for photographs. Several politicians greeted donors. It felt like an entirely different world operating beside the one Caleb inhabited every day. Yet he remembered Emma's question. Who decides where people belong? The answer remained the same. Nobody. Taking a slow breath, Caleb approached the entrance doors with invitation in hand. Inside the ballroom, guests were beginning to take their seats. On the stage, final preparations were underway. Behind a curtain, Victoria Hale reviewed notes she would soon deliver to hundreds of influential people. Neither of them realized that within the next hour, the carefully planned evening would be completely transformed. Caleb handed the invitation to the security guard and waited patiently while guests streamed past on either side of him. The guard scanned the document once. Then again, a small crease formed between his eyebrows. "One moment, sir." Caleb nodded. "Take your time." The guard entered information into a tablet. Several seconds passed. Then he checked the invitation again. "Can I have your name?" "Caleb Foster." The guard typed carefully. More waiting followed. Around them, luxury vehicles continued arriving. Camera flashes illuminated the entrance. Laughter drifted through the revolving doors. The evening moved forward without him. Finally, the guard looked up. "I am sorry, sir. I cannot find you in the guest registry." Caleb blinked once. "That is strange. Do you have any additional documentation?" "Just the invitation." The guard examined it again. "I understand." His voice remained professional. "But without confirmation, I cannot allow entry." Caleb glanced at the ballroom beyond the glass. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of elegantly dressed guests. Somewhere inside, speeches were about to begin. "Could there be another list?" he asked. "A donor list, perhaps?" The guard checked once more. Nothing under that name. Caleb released a slow breath. He had spent enough years dealing with bureaucracy to recognize a dead end when he saw one. "Thank you for checking." The guard seemed surprised by the response. Most people argued. Some became angry. Caleb simply stepped aside. The guard offered an apologetic nod. I am sorry, sir. Not your fault. Nearby, a couple in designer evening wear paused briefly as they entered. The man glanced at Caleb's suit, then at the invitation in his hand. His expression shifted into something between curiosity and assumption. Caleb recognized it immediately. People often created entire stories about strangers within seconds. The couple continued inside. Another guest arrived moments later. Then another. Doors opened. Doors closed. Smiles appeared. Names were recognized. Caleb remained outside. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic from Michigan Avenue. He checked his phone. No new messages. For a moment, he considered leaving. The practical part of him saw no reason to stay. The invitation was likely a mistake. Mistakes happened. He could be home within 40 minutes. Emma would still be awake. They could order pizza and watch an old movie. The evening could quietly return to normal. Yet something stopped him. Not pride. Not stubbornness. Something else. A feeling he could not quite explain. As though the invitation had arrived for a reason. A second security employee approached. Older. More experienced. Sir, I understand there is a registration issue. Apparently. The man accepted the invitation and studied it. Interesting. What is? The invitation itself is authentic. Caleb frowned slightly. So I am not crazy. The security employee smiled faintly. No, sir. He examined the document under the light. This came directly from the event office. Then why is my name missing? I wish I knew. He handed the invitation back. Unfortunately, without authorization, my hands are tied. Caleb nodded. Understood. A light rain began falling, barely noticeable at first. Tiny droplets shimmered beneath the entrance lights. Hotel staff quickly opened umbrellas for arriving guests. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Hundreds of people moved effortlessly into the ballroom, while the one man holding a valid invitation remained outside. Yet Caleb did not complain. Years earlier, during difficult deployments and long nights far from home, he had learned an important lesson. Dignity did not depend on circumstances. It depended on character. His phone vibrated. A new message appeared. Did you make it inside yet? Emma. Caleb smiled despite himself. He stared at the screen for several seconds before typing a reply. Working on it. The response arrived almost instantly. I believe in you. Caleb laughed softly. The guard nearest him heard it. Everything okay? My daughter. The guard smiled. Those messages help. More than she knows. Inside the ballroom, guests were taking their seats. A large screen displayed images of charitable projects funded through the Hale Foundation. Conversations gradually quieted. Event coordinators moved efficiently between tables. On the stage, a spotlight illuminated an empty podium. Behind the curtain, Victoria Hale listened carefully as her assistant repeated the name once again. Caleb Foster. The name struck her like a forgotten melody from another lifetime. For several seconds, she simply stood there. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background. The assistant shifted nervously. Ms. Hale. Victoria slowly looked up. Are you absolutely certain? That is the name on the invitation. Victoria's eyes widened. A dozen old memories rushed back at once. Rain. Floodwater. A frightened family. A stranger who refused recognition. Where is he now? She asked quietly. At the front entrance. Victoria looked toward the stage where hundreds of guests waited for her appearance. Then she looked toward the doors leading outside. And without another word, she turned away from the ballroom. Caleb remained near the entrance while the light rain continued falling around him. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement. Like scattered gold beneath the evening sky, guests continued arriving. Luxury cars rolled forward one after another. Valets hurried through the drizzle carrying umbrellas. The gala moved forward exactly as planned. Yet for reasons Caleb could not explain, he still felt reluctant to leave. The older security employee returned a few minutes later carrying a small radio clipped to his jacket. Any luck? Caleb asked. The man shook his head. Not yet. I figured. For what it is worth, sir, something about this situation does not make sense. Caleb smiled faintly. That makes two of us. The man hesitated. Most registration errors are simple. And this one feels different. Before Caleb could respond, a loud burst of laughter echoed from a nearby group of guests approaching the entrance. 3 men and 2 women stepped from a black sedan. Expensive watches glimmered beneath the hotel lights. Their conversation immediately filled the space around them. One of the men noticed Caleb standing off to the side, holding his invitation. His gaze lingered a second longer than necessary. "Problem at the door?" he asked casually. Caleb offered a polite smile. "Nothing serious." "Forgot your ticket?" one of the women joked. The others laughed lightly. Caleb simply shook his head. "Something like that." The group moved toward the entrance. Their names were recognized immediately. The doors opened. Within seconds, they disappeared inside. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it left behind a familiar feeling. Not anger, not resentment, just a quiet reminder of how quickly people judged what they did not understand. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Emma. "Still alive?" Caleb laughed softly. "Definitely. Barely survived a conversation about fancy shoes." Her response came almost immediately. "Then it sounds dangerous." The simple exchange lifted his spirits. Emma possessed an extraordinary ability to make difficult moments feel smaller. Caleb slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the entrance once more. Inside the ballroom, hundreds of guests had finally taken their seats. Crystal chandeliers illuminated table after table of influential donors, executives, elected officials, and celebrities. The atmosphere carried the polished confidence of people accustomed to being noticed. On stage, a spotlight waited for Victoria Hale. Yet backstage, everything had changed. Victoria moved quickly through a private hallway, while two assistants struggled to keep pace. "Are you sure?" one of them asked. Victoria stopped walking. "Do you know how many years I searched for him?" The assistant fell silent. Victoria continued forward. Her heartbeat had not slowed since hearing the name. Caleb Foster. For more than a decade, it had existed in her memory like a chapter left unfinished. A man who had appeared during the worst day of her family's life and vanished before anyone could properly thank him. The memory remained vivid. Rain, rising water, panic, fear, and one calm stranger whose first concern had been helping others. She remembered asking for his name. She remembered his smile. She remembered him refusing attention. Afterward, every attempt to find him had failed. Years passed. Life moved on. Yet she never forgot. Back at the entrance, Caleb glanced toward the street. The practical part of him was beginning to win the argument. Perhaps it was time to go home. He had honored the invitation. He had tried. There was dignity in accepting circumstances you could not change. He took a step toward the sidewalk. Then another. "Sir." Caleb turned. One of the younger security guards was speaking into an earpiece. His expression had changed completely. "Would you mind waiting just a moment longer?" Caleb looked surprised. "Why?" The guard hesitated. "Someone is coming." Caleb frowned slightly. "Someone?" The guard nodded. "Yes, sir." Before Caleb could ask another question, activity suddenly increased near the entrance. Hotel staff exchanged glances. Event coordinators appeared from inside the building. A manager hurried across the lobby. Something was happening. Guests arriving from the curb began slowing down, noticing the unusual movement. The rain softened into a mist. The revolving doors turned once, then again, then stopped completely. Silence seemed to spread outward from the entrance like ripples. Across still water, Caleb stood motionless as every eye gradually shifted toward the hotel doors. And somewhere inside, walking steadily through a corridor lined with astonished staff members, Victoria Hale was heading directly toward the one man she had never expected to see again. Caleb stood quietly near the entrance as the strange shift in atmosphere continued spreading through the hotel. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only a fine mist drifting beneath the lights. Valets paused in the middle of their work. Hotel staff exchanged uncertain glances. Even guests arriving from the curb seemed aware that something unusual was unfolding. The revolving doors remained still. No one appeared to understand why, least of all Caleb. "Sir, thank you for waiting," the younger security guard said again. "I'm still not sure what I am waiting for." The guard smiled nervously. "Honestly, neither am I." That answer made Caleb laugh softly. It was the first completely honest thing anyone had said about the situation all evening. His phone vibrated. Another message from Emma. "Did they finally realize you are secretly famous?" Caleb shook his head and typed back. "Not yet." Her response arrived immediately. "Keep trying." The exchange brought a smile to his face. Nearby, the older security employee noticed. "Your daughter again?" "Always. She sounds like a good kid." Caleb nodded. "She is the best thing that ever happened to me." The older man smiled. "I can tell." For a brief moment, the tension surrounding the entrance seemed to ease. Then the revolving doors finally moved. Every conversation nearby slowed. Several hotel employees immediately stepped aside. A pair of event coordinators appeared, walking quickly through the lobby. One of them adjusted an earpiece while scanning the crowd. The other spoke quietly into a phone. Whatever was happening, it was clearly significant. Caleb watched with growing curiosity. Across the entrance plaza, a group of wealthy guests who had arrived earlier paused before entering. One of the businessmen who had made the comment about tickets turned around and frowned. "What is going on?" he asked no one in particular. Nobody answered. The hotel manager suddenly appeared from inside and moved directly toward the entrance. His expression carried equal parts urgency and disbelief. He looked around the plaza before his eyes settled on Caleb. The manager froze for half a second. Then he immediately straightened his tie. Caleb noticed the reaction but could not make sense of it. "Something tells me this is about you," the older security employee said. "That would be impressive considering I have no idea what is happening." The man chuckled. "Fair point." Inside the ballroom, hundreds of guests waited beneath crystal chandeliers. The orchestra had already completed its introduction. Conversations grew louder as people began wondering why the evening had not officially started. Several prominent donors checked their watches. Television crews adjusted cameras. On stage, the spotlight remained fixed on an empty podium. Victoria Hale was nowhere to be seen. The absence had not gone unnoticed. Backstage, assistants were growing increasingly nervous. "The audience is waiting," one whispered. Victoria barely heard her. She continued walking through the corridor toward the front entrance. Each step felt surreal. For years she had imagined what she might say if she ever found Caleb Foster again. Yet now that the moment was approaching, every carefully prepared thought seemed inadequate. Gratitude rarely fit neatly into words, especially when it had waited more than a decade. At the entrance, Caleb looked toward the street again. "Maybe I should just leave." The younger security guard immediately shook his head. "Please do not." "Why?" "Because I am fairly certain somebody would be very upset." Caleb laughed. "You still do not know who?" "No, sir. Neither do I." The absurdity of the situation almost made him smile. Almost. Then another change swept through the crowd. This time everyone felt it. The revolving doors opened once more. Not quickly, not dramatically, simply opening with a quiet certainty that drew every eye toward them. Several hotel staff members stepped aside at the exact same moment. Guests stopped talking. The manager straightened immediately. The security guards exchanged glances. And Caleb found himself looking toward the entrance alongside everyone else. A woman emerged from the lobby. Elegant, composed, confident. Her dark evening gown reflected the warm light spilling from the ballroom behind her. The crowd recognized her instantly. So did the photographers across the street. Cameras lifted. Conversations died. The billionaire host of the evening had just abandoned her own gala. Yet she did not look toward the cameras. She did not acknowledge the waiting guests. She did not glance at the reporters. Her eyes searched only for one person. And the moment they found Caleb Foster standing beneath the hotel lights, her entire expression changed. For several seconds, nobody moved. The mist drifted softly beneath the entrance lights while the city hummed quietly beyond the hotel grounds. Victoria Hale stood just outside the revolving doors, her attention fixed entirely on Caleb Foster. The photographers who had rushed forward expecting a publicity moment quickly realized something unusual was happening. Victoria was not posing. She was not acknowledging cameras. She was not greeting donors. She was simply staring at a man most of them had never heard of. Caleb looked back at her with equal confusion. He recognized her face immediately. Almost everyone in America did. Television interviews, magazine covers, charity campaigns. Yet the expression in her eyes made no sense. It was not the polite smile of a billionaire greeting a guest. It was something deeper, more personal, more emotional. The hotel manager straightened nervously beside the entrance. Several staff members exchanged uncertain glances. Nobody seemed to know what to do next. Victoria took a step forward, then another. The movement was calm, deliberate, and completely unplanned. The crowd instinctively parted for her. Caleb remained where he was. His invitation still rested in his hand. "Sir," the younger security guard whispered, "I think she is coming to see you." Caleb laughed softly. "That would be surprising." The guard looked at him. "I do not think surprise is avoiding us anymore." Victoria continued walking. Her eyes never left Caleb. Memories flooded her mind with every step. The rainstorm, the flooded roadway, her father trapped with several stranded families, emergency responders delayed by weather conditions, fear everywhere. Then a former soldier appearing out of nowhere and calmly helping people reach safety. She remembered how exhausted he looked. She remembered asking for his name. Most of all, she remembered what happened afterward. He had disappeared before anyone could thank him. No interviews, no recognition, no reward, just gone. For years she wondered if she would ever see him again. Now he stood 20 feet away wearing a slightly worn navy suit and looking as though he would rather be anywhere else. The realization almost made her smile. Caleb noticed people beginning to stare. More guests had gathered near the entrance. Even those arriving from the street seemed reluctant to walk inside. Curiosity had taken over. "Do I know you?" Caleb asked quietly when Victoria finally stopped a few feet away. The question was honest. Victoria smiled gently. "Not really." Caleb nodded. "That is what I thought." Several nearby guests looked bewildered. The billionaire host had abandoned her gala to greet a stranger she apparently did not know. The scene made no sense. Victoria glanced briefly at the invitation in Caleb's hand. Then her expression changed. A flash of disappointment crossed her face. "They would not let you in." It was not a question. Caleb shook his head. "Registration issue." Victoria looked toward the security team. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The answer was obvious. Caleb immediately stepped forward. "It is not their fault." The words came naturally. Everyone was professional. Victoria studied him for a moment. Even now, after being embarrassed in front of hundreds of people, he was protecting others from blame. Some things never changed. "That sounds like you," she said softly. Caleb frowned. "Have we met?" Victoria laughed quietly through sudden emotion. "Once." The single word deepened the mystery surrounding them. The hotel manager looked completely lost. The photographers continued taking pictures. Guests whispered among themselves. Yet Victoria seemed unaware of any of it. Her attention remained focused on Caleb alone. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra had stopped playing entirely. Word was spreading through the event. Something unexpected was happening at the entrance. More people began drifting toward the lobby. The evening's carefully planned schedule was rapidly unraveling. Victoria glanced toward the ballroom doors and then back toward Caleb. "You know," she said, "I spent years hoping I would get the chance to thank you." Caleb blinked. "Thank me?" "Yes." "For what?" Victoria looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You really do not remember, do you?" Caleb searched his memory. "Nothing." He slowly shook his head. Victoria smiled again, but this time her eyes glistened beneath the hotel lights. "That is exactly why I never forgot you." Around them, the crowd fell completely silent. And for the first time all evening, Caleb Foster realized that whatever story had brought him to the entrance of this gala had begun long before the invitation ever arrived. The silence surrounding the hotel entrance seemed to deepen with every passing second. Guests who had spent their lives commanding attention now stood quietly watching someone else receive it. The mist drifted through the warm glow of the entrance lights, while Victoria Hale and Caleb Foster remained facing one another. Caleb could feel dozens of eyes fixed on him, yet none of that mattered as much as the confusion growing inside his own mind. "I am sorry," he said gently. "I wish I remembered." Victoria nodded as though she expected that answer. "You helped a lot of people that year." "What year?" 12 years ago. Her voice softened. "Spring floods along the Rock River." Something flickered across Caleb's face. Not recognition exactly. More like a distant memory trying to return. Victoria continued. Entire neighborhoods were underwater. Roads disappeared. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly. Fragments began surfacing. Rain. Mud. Long nights. Families needing help. "I was still in the army then," he said quietly. "Yes." Victoria smiled. "You were." Several people standing nearby exchanged surprised glances. The revelation moved through the crowd like a whisper. "Veteran." Suddenly pieces of the story began fitting together. Caleb stared past Victoria toward the city lights. There were a lot of people involved. Most people left when conditions became difficult. That is not true. It is true enough. Victoria folded her hands in front of her. "My father was among those stranded." Caleb frowned. "Your father?" His vehicle became trapped near a flooded bridge. The memory returned another step. Caleb remembered dozens of stranded drivers, elderly couples, parents with children, exhausted first responders. Faces had blended together over time. There were many families. Yes. Victoria smiled faintly. That is the point. Caleb looked at her. What do you mean? You never asked who anyone was. The answer settled between them, around them, throughout the entire entrance plaza. Victoria glanced toward the ballroom doors where guests continued gathering to watch. You did not know my father owned companies. No, you did not know he was wealthy. No, you did not know reporters were looking for stories. Caleb shook his head. No, Victoria's eyes brightened with emotion. You only knew people needed help. Nobody spoke after that. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any speech. The older security employee lowered his gaze. The hotel manager looked visibly uncomfortable. Even some of the guests who had judged Caleb earlier seemed to be rethinking their assumptions. Caleb shifted slightly. I still do not understand why I am here. Victoria laughed softly through tears she was trying not to show. That sounds exactly like something you would say. Because it is true. You are here because gratitude should not expire. The words hung in the evening air. Victoria looked around at the crowd. Do you know how many people tried to find you afterward? Caleb blinked. Find me. My father hired investigators. Why? To thank you. Caleb actually laughed. That seems excessive. Several nearby guests smiled. Victoria shook her head. You disappeared. I went home. Exactly. More laughter followed. The tension that had dominated the evening continued melting away. Yet beneath the warmth remained something deeper. Respect. Genuine respect. Victoria took a slow breath. My father never forgot what you did. Her voice grew quieter. Neither did I. Caleb looked down at the invitation still resting in his hand. Suddenly it made a little more sense. Not all of it, but enough. So you sent this? Personally. And somehow my name vanished from the registry. Victoria turned toward the hotel manager. He looked as though he wished the ground would open beneath him. We will be discussing that later, she said gently. The manager nodded immediately. Caleb stepped forward. Please do not be too hard on anyone. Victoria closed her eyes briefly and laughed. There you are again. What? Making it impossible to stay upset. The crowd laughed with her. Inside the ballroom, the schedule was completely forgotten now. Nobody cared about timing. Nobody cared about speeches. The evening had become something else entirely. Something real. Victoria looked toward the entrance doors and then back at Caleb. There is something I need to do. Caleb raised an eyebrow. What is that? Her smile widened. Correct a mistake. Then, in full view of every guest, every employee, every donor, and every reporter standing nearby, Victoria Hale extended her hand toward Caleb Foster and invited him to walk inside beside her. For a brief moment, Caleb simply stared at the hand Victoria had extended toward him. Around them, the entrance plaza remained silent. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving only shimmering reflections across the pavement. Guests who had arrived expecting an elegant evening fundraiser were witnessing something far different. They were watching a billionaire publicly honor a man most of them had overlooked less than an hour earlier. Caleb glanced at Victoria and then at the crowd surrounding them. You really do not have to do this, he said quietly. Victoria smiled. Yes, I do. I am not looking for attention. I know. Her answer came immediately. That is one of the reasons we are standing here. A few people nearby exchanged knowing smiles. Caleb laughed softly and shook his head. Some situations could not be argued away. With quiet reluctance, he accepted her invitation. Together they began walking toward the entrance. The reaction was immediate. Hotel staff stepped aside. Security personnel straightened. Guests parted naturally to create space. Nobody had instructed them to do so. Respect had simply taken over where assumptions had existed before. As they entered the lobby, conversation stopped entirely. The enormous marble floor reflected the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. Expensive suits, evening gowns, political figures, business leaders, athletes, entertainers. Hundreds of eyes followed them. Caleb suddenly felt more uncomfortable than he had outside. I like the parking lot better, he murmured. Victoria laughed. I suspected you might. Less people. Slightly. The hotel manager hurried forward. His face carried a mixture of relief and embarrassment. Ms. Hale, I sincerely apologize for what happened. Victoria looked at him kindly. We will talk later. Caleb immediately added. It was an honest mistake. The manager looked genuinely grateful. Thank you, sir. Victoria glanced at Caleb. You are making it very difficult for anyone to feel guilty. That is not my intention. I know. They continued through the lobby. Inside the ballroom, nearly every guest had risen from their seat in an effort to see what was happening. The orchestra members sat quietly with their instruments resting in their laps. Event staff had completely abandoned the evening schedule. Nobody seemed concerned. The atmosphere had shifted from formality to curiosity. As Victoria and Caleb approached the ballroom entrance, she slowed slightly. Before we go in, she said, there is something you should know. Caleb looked at her. Okay. My father wanted to thank you personally for years. Caleb listened quietly. He passed away 3 years ago. The warmth in Victoria's expression remained, but sadness briefly touched her eyes. I am sorry, Caleb said sincerely. Thank you. She nodded. Before he died, he made me promise something. What was that? If I ever found you, I would make sure you understood how much your kindness meant. Caleb lowered his eyes for a moment. The words affected him more than he expected, not because he wanted recognition, but because he remembered how many difficult days existed in the world. Most people never learned what happened after offering help. They never discovered whether a small act changed anything. Victoria seemed to sense his thoughts. It mattered, she said softly. More than you know. Then she placed a gentle hand on his arm and guided him into the ballroom. The room was magnificent. Towering chandeliers illuminated dozens of round tables dressed in white linen. Fresh flowers filled the air with a subtle fragrance. Large screens displayed images from charitable projects around the country. Yet despite all the elegance surrounding them, nobody was looking at the decorations. Every guest was focused on the unexpected pair entering together. Caleb immediately recognized some faces from television. Governors, CEOs, public figures. He felt entirely out of place. Victoria appeared completely at ease. Relax, she whispered. Easy for you to say. Probably. The crowd remained standing. Not because anyone instructed them to, because something about the moment felt significant. Several people began applauding quietly. Then others joined. Within seconds, the entire ballroom filled with applause. Caleb stopped walking. Please tell them to stop. Victoria laughed. That is not how applause works. The sound continued growing. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Respectful. Genuine. The kind of applause that carried gratitude rather than spectacle. Caleb felt his face grow warm. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding attention. Yet somehow he had become the center of the evening. Across the room, television cameras adjusted position. Reporters whispered to one another. Guests who had never heard the name Caleb Foster were suddenly eager to learn more. Victoria led him toward the stage. Every step increased the mystery. Every step raised more questions. And as they reached the front of the ballroom beneath the glow of the stage lights, Caleb realized that whatever explanation Victoria planned to give, the entire room was about to hear it. The applause gradually faded as Victoria and Caleb reached the stage. The ballroom settled into a silence so complete that even the faint hum of the lighting system seemed noticeable. Hundreds of guests remained standing. Nobody appeared eager to sit down. They sensed that something important was about to happen. Victoria stepped behind the podium, but did not immediately begin speaking. Instead, she looked out across the room, taking in the faces of donors, executives, elected officials, community leaders, and journalists. Then she looked back at Caleb standing several feet away, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. The sight made her smile. Ladies and gentlemen, she began softly, I spent weeks preparing a speech for tonight. A few guests laughed quietly. I am not going to give that speech. More laughter followed. The tension in the room eased slightly. Victoria folded her notes and placed them aside. Tonight was supposed to be about generosity. She paused. It still is. The room grew quiet again. 12 years ago, my family experienced one of the most frightening days of our lives. Images immediately formed in the minds of those listening. A severe flood left dozens of families stranded. Roads were impassable. Communication systems were failing. People were scared. Victoria's voice remained calm, but emotion lingered beneath every word. Among those families was mine. Caleb lowered his eyes. He was beginning to remember more clearly now. Not specific faces. Not names. Just long hours helping wherever help was needed. Victoria continued. Many people did extraordinary work during those days. First responders, volunteers, neighbors helping neighbors. She smiled faintly, and among them was a young Army veteran named Caleb Foster. A spotlight subtly shifted toward him. Caleb immediately looked uncomfortable. Several guests smiled. Others leaned forward in their chairs. Victoria noticed and deliberately softened the attention. The interesting part is not what he did. Caleb looked relieved for half a second. The interesting part is what happened afterward. The room listened carefully. Nothing. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Victoria smiled. No interviews. No recognition. No requests. No publicity. She looked directly at Caleb. He simply helped people and went home. The simplicity of the statement landed harder than any dramatic story could have. My father spent years trying to find him. Victoria continued. Not because he owed him money. Not because he wanted a photograph. He wanted to say thank you. Across the ballroom, several guests exchanged thoughtful glances. Gratitude was something many people talked about. Far fewer pursued it for over a decade. Unfortunately, my father never got the chance. Victoria's voice softened. But before he passed away, he asked me to make a promise. She paused. Find Caleb Foster. The room remained completely silent. And when I finally found him, make sure he understood something. Victoria turned toward Caleb. Her eyes glistened beneath the stage lights. What he did mattered. Caleb looked genuinely moved. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. Victoria stepped away from the podium and stood beside him. Most people measure value through visibility. She looked out at the audience again. They assume the most important people are the ones standing on stages, appearing in headlines, or sitting in boardrooms. Her gaze returned to Caleb. But some of the most important people quietly repair schools, raise children, serve their communities, and help strangers without expecting anything in return. The room erupted into applause once more. This time it felt different. Not polite, not ceremonial, genuine. Several guests rose fully to their feet. Then more followed. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was standing. Caleb looked overwhelmed. Victoria leaned closer and quietly said, "You can stop trying to disappear now." He laughed softly. "I am considering my options." The audience laughed with him. The warmth in the room continued growing. Not because of wealth. Not because of influence. Because people recognized authenticity when they saw it. Victoria waited until the applause settled again. Then she reached into her evening bag and removed a small folded piece of paper. "There is one more thing." Caleb looked puzzled. "What is that?" Victoria smiled. "A letter." "From who?" Her smile widened. "Someone who insisted I deliver it personally." Caleb accepted the paper slowly, completely unaware that the words waiting inside would connect this remarkable evening to the most important person in his life. Caleb accepted the folded paper and looked at it uncertainly. The ballroom remained completely silent. Hundreds of people watched from their tables while crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the room. Victoria stepped back slightly, giving him space. "Go ahead," she said gently. Caleb unfolded the note. At first he assumed it would be something from Victoria's father, perhaps a message prepared years earlier. Instead, the moment he saw the handwriting, his entire expression changed. He recognized it immediately. Emma. A smile appeared before he had even read the first sentence. The audience noticed. Victoria noticed too. "My daughter wrote this?" Caleb asked quietly. Victoria nodded. "She helped me plan part of tonight." Caleb looked genuinely shocked. "What?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Victoria smiled. "You are not the only person who can keep a secret." Caleb shook his head and began reading. The room remained silent. The note was short, simple, honest. Everything Emma wrote usually was. "Dad, if you are reading this, it means you actually stayed. I knew you would want to leave. You always do when attention starts heading your way. But sometimes good people deserve to hear the good things others say about them. You spend your life helping everyone else. Tonight, let people help you see yourself the way I do. Love, Emma." For a moment Caleb could not speak. He simply stared at the page. The audience could not see the words, but they could see their effect. Victoria quietly handed him a glass of water. "She sounds amazing," Victoria said. Caleb laughed softly. "She is." The warmth in the room deepened. Many guests smiled. Some parents exchanged knowing looks. Across the ballroom, several people wiped away tears they had not expected to shed during a charity gala. Caleb carefully folded the note and placed it inside his jacket pocket. "I am going to have a conversation with that kid later." Victoria laughed. "Good luck. You corrupted her." "I inspired her." More laughter followed. The atmosphere felt entirely different now. The formal barriers that had existed at the beginning of the evening were gone. Wealth no longer seemed important. Titles no longer seemed important. What mattered was character. Victoria returned to the podium. "There is something else everyone should know." The room immediately quieted again. "When I finally located Caleb several months ago, I did not contact him right away." Caleb looked surprised. "You found me months ago?" "Yes." "Why did you not say anything?" Victoria smiled. "Because I wanted to understand who you became." Caleb shook his head in disbelief. "That sounds mildly terrifying." The audience laughed again. Victoria continued. "I spoke with people in his community." Caleb groaned softly. "Oh no. Teachers." More laughter. "Parents." Caleb covered his face briefly. "Please stop." "Students." The room erupted again. Victoria waited for the laughter to settle. Then her voice softened. Every single person told the same story. The ballroom grew quiet. Not one person mentioned military service first. Caleb looked up. Not one person mentioned awards. Victoria paused. They talked about a father who never missed a school event. The room listened carefully. They talked about a man who repaired things before anyone asked. They talked about someone who stayed late when help was needed. They talked about kindness. Silence followed. The good kind. The kind that arrives when truth fills a room. Victoria looked toward the audience. We often celebrate success as though it begins in boardrooms or headlines. Her eyes shifted toward Caleb. But some of the most important success stories happen quietly. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. A man raises his daughter after loss. A father shows up every day. A veteran continues serving his community long after his uniform is gone. Several guests nodded. Others lowered their eyes in reflection. Victoria smiled gently. "That is why tonight matters." She turned toward Caleb again. "Not because of what happened 12 years ago." Caleb looked surprised. "Then why?" Victoria's smile widened. "Because of everything that happened." Afterward, the audience rose into another standing ovation. This time it lasted longer. Not because people were impressed, because they were moved. Caleb stood quietly beneath the stage lights, humbled and uncomfortable and grateful all at once. And as the applause filled the ballroom, he realized something he had never fully understood before. The life he considered ordinary had quietly become extraordinary in the eyes of others. The applause continued for several moments before gradually settling into a warm silence. Caleb stood beneath the stage lights with one hand resting lightly against the pocket holding Emma's note. Around him, some of the most influential people in the country remained standing. Yet the attention no longer felt overwhelming. Somehow, through Victoria's words and Emma's letter, the evening had become less about recognition and more about gratitude. Victoria stepped forward once more and smiled at the audience. "There is one final thing I would like to do tonight." The room immediately grew quiet again. "When this event was first planned, we intended to honor organizations." She glanced toward Caleb. "Instead, we found ourselves honoring the values those organizations exist to protect." Several guests nodded. Victoria turned toward a large screen behind the stage. With a simple gesture, an image appeared. It was not a corporate logo. It was a photograph. Caleb froze the moment he saw it. The picture showed him and Emma at a school fundraiser 6 months earlier. They were laughing about something neither of them could now remember. The image was imperfect, natural, real. "Where did you get that?" Caleb asked. Victoria laughed softly. "Your daughter may have helped." The audience laughed with her. Another photograph appeared. Caleb repairing a bookshelf in the school library. Then another. Caleb helping students unload supplies before a community event. Then another. Caleb standing in the crowd at a school concert, recording Emma's performance with obvious pride. No grand achievements. No dramatic moments. Just ordinary acts of service. Victoria looked toward the audience. "This is what character looks like." Nobody spoke. The images continued slowly. A life built from small choices repeated consistently over many years. Respect, responsibility, kindness, service. The values seemed to fill the ballroom more powerfully than any speech could. Caleb lowered his eyes briefly. He felt humbled by the attention, yet he also understood what Victoria was trying to say. Great lives were not built through single moments. They were built through thousands of ordinary decisions. Victoria finally returned her attention to him. My father used to say that the strongest people are often the quietest. She smiled. I did not fully understand that until tonight. Caleb shook his head. Your father gave me far too much credit. Victoria laughed. And there you are again. More laughter spread through the room. Then Victoria surprised everyone. Emma is watching. Caleb blinked. What? A video screen suddenly changed. Emma appeared live from home, sitting on the family couch wearing oversized pajamas and an expression of complete satisfaction. The ballroom erupted into delighted laughter. Hi, Dad, she said. Caleb covered his face with one hand. Oh, no. Emma grinned. Oh, yes. Even Victoria laughed. Emma, would you like to say something? Emma nodded. Sure. She looked directly into the camera. My dad does not think he is special. The room immediately fell silent again. He thinks he is just doing what he is supposed to do. Caleb stared at the screen. Emma continued. But every kid deserves someone who shows up. Every school deserves people who care. Every community needs people who help without asking for anything back. Her voice remained steady. That is who my dad is. Not a single person interrupted. So if he looks uncomfortable right now, that means everything is working exactly as planned. The ballroom exploded with laughter and applause. Caleb laughed too, shaking his head in surrender. Victoria wiped away a tear. She is remarkable. I know, Caleb said quietly. When the applause finally faded, Victoria addressed the audience one last time. Tonight began with a misunderstanding at the front door. She paused, but perhaps it also reminded us of something important. Her eyes moved across the ballroom. We never truly know the value of a person by looking at them. Complete silence followed. The most important people in our lives are often not the loudest, not the richest, not the most visible. Her gaze settled on Caleb. Sometimes they are simply the people who choose kindness again and again and again. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The truth of the moment seemed to settle gently across the room. A few minutes later, guests returned to their tables. Conversations resumed. The evening finally continued. Yet something had changed. The atmosphere felt warmer, more human, less concerned with status. As Caleb eventually prepared to leave, Victoria walked with him toward the entrance. The city lights still shimmered beyond the hotel windows. Thank you for coming, she said. Caleb smiled. Thank Emma. Victoria laughed. Fair point. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Caleb looked toward the night sky beyond the city and thought about how close he had come to leaving. One registration error. One moment of embarrassment. One decision to walk away. Instead, he would return home carrying something far more valuable than recognition. A reminder that dignity never needs an audience, that grace leaves a mark long after the moment has passed, and that the people who deserve the greatest respect are often the ones asking for none at all.